là bà của tôi ơi. Tôi trở về để nói cho các bạn biết rằng tôi đã chết.
Vietnam War. Spectral voices emerged from the depths of the jungle, and the soldiers who were waiting for their moment to attack were invaded by uncontrollable chills throughout their bodies. A fierce battle was breaking out between the North and the South, leaving behind thousands of souls who, according to the beliefs of the locals, were destined to wander eternally. A war is extremely challenging, both physically and psychologically. And these encounters with the afterlife can become a key element. It was no longer just the American bullets that generated terror in the Viet Cong fighters. Now the ghosts of the fallen tormented them and penetrated the depths of their minds. With only two apparent options: surrender so as not to end up the same way, or endure the fury of the world of the living, and also that of the dead. But were there supernatural encounters on the battlefield? What is hidden behind those voices? If you want to know the answers to all those questions, then stay with us, because in this new military history video, we'll be going over all about the ghostly moans of the Vietnam War.
Now, a lot of people believe that the jungles of Vietnam are haunted, especially considering that over 300,000 people are still unaccounted for just from the period of the Vietnam War.
Superstitions have accompanied man for thousands of years, rooting beliefs or practices that seem irrational, but that penetrate very deeply into societies. They are usually associated with magic, the mystical, or the supernatural, and even linked to the occult, but far from having any scientific basis. In the case of Vietnam, the scene of a brutal war with millions of deaths that bathed these lands in blood, was the most appropriate context for some legends linked to their religious faith to become known. The most striking was the one that claimed that on the anniversary of a person's death, a spiritual portal could open between our world and the afterlife. This provided the possibility of communicating with the deceased, an inexplicable phenomenon but known and accepted by all the inhabitants of the place. In addition, another aspect of these stories had to do with the kind of spirits that could be accessed. They were wandering souls, that is, people who, upon dying, had not been buried correctly and were trapped in this plane without achieving eternal rest. In this case, it could happen with the corpses of the killed soldiers who disappeared on the battlefield and, without being able to find a proper burial, presented themselves to their comrades, seeking to be saved. A former North Vietnamese soldier named Bao Ninh wrote a book after the war, in which he not only recounted what it was like to experience the brutality of the conflict and its atrocities, but also referred to this concept of the relationship with the fallen. In a short story about the fate of the 27th Battalion of North Vietnam, annihilated by American and South Vietnamese troops in a jungle area, the writer noted that the voices of the killed combatants could be heard in the place. He said, "From then on, it was called the Jungle of Screaming Souls. Just hearing their name whispered sent a chill down the spine. Perhaps the screaming souls gathered on special holidays as members of the Lost Battalion. The sobbing whispers could be heard in the depths of the night, the howls carried away by the wind. Perhaps they really were the voices of the wandering souls of the dead soldiers." This look into the afterlife was something very common for the locals, so it was not hidden from others. They spoke openly about their beliefs and did not mind if the fear of a death that would turn them into a wandering soul was known. The ghosts in the middle of the jungle were just one more reminder of what they faced during the battle. The possibility of eternal suffering. And as if that were not enough, the beliefs and legends did not only affect the Vietnamese, but even the allies that participated in the conflict, such as the United States, had their own fears in the field.
Superstition was a powerful weapon in the Vietnam War. In fact, both sides had their share of ghost stories.
There's a story involving American soldiers crawling down a tunnel to find the Viet Cong. But instead, they heard a female voice calling for them as they left. And there were also reports from soldiers of ghostly figures moving through trees and fanged creatures who would try to kidnap and eat troops while they were in the jungle.
Involved in the war, Washington's forces were aware that the North Vietnamese soldiers they killed in combat would die far from home. So their bodies would probably never be found to be properly buried. That way, they were sure to become wandering souls after being killed, and that worried them too. Since no one would want the ghost of an enemy to haunt them in the middle of the dangerous jungle. However, a good part of Americans did not believe in these legends, although they recognized the enormous respect that the inhabitants of Vietnam had for the dead. The fact is that the society of the country located in Southeast Asia had an incredible bond with the spirits of the deceased. A perfect example is that of a woman who owned a restaurant. One day, a client asked her about the 3 graves that could be seen in the garden of the place. None had a plaque with names, as is usually done, but they looked carefully cared for, with fresh flowers. The owner replied that the bodies of young soldiers from the North Vietnamese forces were there. They had died while retreating from battle, and the corpses had ended up on her doorstep. So the woman complained to the authorities, saying that they could cause illness to people who came to her restaurant. A military officer told her to temporarily bury them in her garden, and that he would send someone to remove them later. After complying with that request, the owner of the place said that on the same night that this happened, she had a strange dream. She was in an empty and silent room when the door began to slowly open. At that moment, she began to hear several footsteps approaching, but the figures were hidden in the shadows, while she was completely paralyzed and unable to move a single muscle in her body. Suddenly, 3 small children were standing next to her, dressed in civilian clothes but with a northern accent that made her assume that they were the dead soldiers. Beyond the fear that had turned the dream into a nightmare, everything ended with the gratitude of his visitors, who then walked away until they disappeared. She said that somehow after burying the bodies, her business prospered despite the war. She firmly believed that it was the spirits of the men who were helping her, and when officials came to ask her to allow them to move the remains to a military cemetery, she refused, saying that there were no combatants in her garden, only 3 relatives who had died during the conflict. This is just one of many stories that speak of the powerful bond between the Vietnamese and their dead. However, the fear of being a wandering soul was not enough to persuade the communist troops who continued to fiercely attack the alliance between the Americans and the South Vietnamese forces. Still, the spirits continued to make themselves present in the dark, blood-soaked jungle to try to dissuade the warriors.
There was a recognition that people in Vietnam had religious beliefs and superstitions whereby the souls of dead people were wandering in the forests and in the jungles.
This phrase was one that haunted the soldiers and was first heard in a thick jungle region in South Vietnam's Hue Nga province. There, the most chilling sounds came to life. Sad wails, sobs, and sinister screams filled the air. Unearthly voices that seemed to come from everywhere, but nowhere in particular. And amidst the eerie chorus came a clearly audible warning. "My friends, I am dead. It's hell. Don't end up like me. Go home before it's too late." The eerie warning was followed by a chorus of other strange noises. Gongs beating, women crying, and the voice of the little girl we heard calling for her father. To the Viet Cong soldiers hiding in the darkness beyond the enemy perimeter, all of this sounded like the wandering souls of their deceased comrades. According to local beliefs, there was talk of the spirits of the dead who could not return home to receive a proper burial. They had been condemned to walk the earth in torment until their remains were found and properly buried. The legends were becoming more real than ever to the senses of the fighters, who were already living moments of high stress due to the battle. While the communist guerrillas listened to this terrifying phenomenon, trying to identify if the stories they had heard all their lives were becoming reality, their enemies decided to take advantage of the confusion in the field. A normal day for the Viet Cong fighters took them deep into the jungle during the thick night, in the middle of the silence, and waiting for their moment to attack. They knew that their rivals from South Vietnam and the United States would soon make some move to expose themselves, and that would be their signal to unleash hell against them. However, now they found themselves with a new adversary, one much more difficult to face. Every time they were in their positions waiting for the right moment to open fire, the voices of the ghosts would make themselves heard, driving a large part of the unit mad. In the midst of terror, the shooting would begin, but apparently directed only at the spectral beings who were asking to abandon a senseless war that would only condemn them to eternal suffering.
Vợ tôi kêu tôi đang về. Bà đang về với con. Tôi đã về với mình đây, nhưng tôi còn đâu mảnh hình hài nữa.
Completely terrified by what was happening around them and tormented by the voices, many of the North Vietnamese were captured by U.S. soldiers who roamed the jungle after the wild shootings that had broken out against the ghosts. This was repeated night after night, and as the days went by, more and more communist Viet Cong recruits fell into the hands of the enemy because of the fear of the spirits that appeared to them in the middle of the battle. The strategy of the Americans and their allies was to take advantage of their rivals' fear of being condemned to wander like a wandering soul. And for a time it seemed that they had gained a great advantage thanks to this. But then, were the ghosts on the side of South Vietnam? Or what was behind the mysterious voices?
Amid the war, the United States forces started paying attention to this concept of the wandering souls. First, American propagandists released a series of radio broadcasts and wrapped leaflets over North Vietnam. The flyers read, quote, "Comrades, demand that the Communist Party stop its war of aggression in the South, so that no more innocent souls have to join the already great number of innocent souls now wandering in this war-torn country of the South."
Washington's forces had found a way to profit from local legends, and they were not going to let it go. That's how Operation Wandering Soul was born. U.S. troops began to implement a new tool known as Ghost Tape, or Ghost Tape number 10. What for the Vietnamese were supernatural sounds from beyond were actually part of a broadcast that was being broadcast throughout the countryside by American soldiers armed with portable speakers. In fact, the entire program had been recorded weeks before in a sound studio in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. Engineers spent weeks trying to combine the most terrifying sounds, using concepts similar to those used during a radio program or a horror movie. The design was a great success, even sending shivers down the spines of the Americans themselves, who knew the truth behind these screams and moans. The military campaign exploited the beliefs of the people in Vietnam to the maximum, incorporating the voices recorded through an echo chamber to represent the soul of a soldier in pain. Behind this mental weapon was the 6th Peswayat Battalion, the acronym used for the commandos in charge of psychological warfare operations carried out by the United States. And the result of their work had been the aforementioned and disturbing phantom tape, which was intended to frighten and demoralize the enemy. And with a bit of luck, it would even force many to desert their positions.
During night ambush patrols, the battalion would set up small speakers in trees near where the enemy troops were located. Then they'd play the tape for hours, to no reaction other than random shooting. Later on, they'd capture enemy soldiers, who would admit to hearing the recording and feeling frightened by it.
The trick was beyond doubt and conviction. For a start, any soldier who heard the recording in a situation as stressful as that of combat would already have an impact on his state of mind. But also, at some point, it would not matter if the combatants believed that they were real voices from a plane beyond the earthly. They could be sure that the sounds were a hoax, but their beliefs would still exist. And the phantom tape was a reminder that the possibility of dying far from home was present. If that happened, their soul would have no rest. Faced with all these alternatives that benefited them, several American units used the recordings in different areas of Vietnam. That is how the horror show spread quickly.
Ghost tape number 10 was the most frightening and diabolical mixtape ever created.
The message was demoralizing and compelling. This is senseless killing. What folly, folly, friends, as long as you are alive, there is still a chance for you to be reunited with your loved ones. Go home, my friends. The tape was used in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and despite mixed results, it was clear that it was a weapon as powerful as it was chilling. The US government even went so far as to restrict its use because of its mental impact, and began to allow its deployment only in extreme situations. Vietnam War veteran Chad Spar, who was the leader of the U.S. Army's 6th Battalion Psychological Operations Team, recalled that they had drawn from deep within the religion of the Vietnamese to create their attack. One of the important principles of Buddhism is that when a person dies within a very short period of time, they should be buried in consecrated ground in a family plot. The tape played on that. It was very disturbing, very creepy and effective. The ghost tape allowed for several blows to be dealt to the enemy. It was the central axis of the night sorties in which infantry units patrolled areas where the enemy presence was suspected. There, small speakers were placed in the trees and the recording was played for a couple of hours. Then it was time for the ambush. Generally, prisoners caught in this type of operation were interrogated and reported that they had heard the tape and panicked. One afternoon, after a full day of battle in the villages, Spar and his interpreter moved to a small palm grove about 300 meters north of the compound in which they were located. They climbed a tree and hung the sound players pointing towards the villages. At first, there was no reaction to the transmission, but then they began to receive shots from snipers at random. During the following days, the locations of the speakers and the intensity of the audio varied, but the shots always came. When they discovered where the guns had come from, they went to the place in search of the shooter. When they did not find him, the interpreter told the people of the village that if they did not hand over the fighter or the weapon that was being used, the spirits would return. It was then that an old woman showed them the place where a Chinese-made SKS rifle was hidden. After seizing it, the American and his translator began to pack their things to leave. The local Vietnamese district chief came to say goodbye and said he was glad they were leaving. When asked why, he explained that the recordings of Wandering Souls had made his own men and family very nervous. Even though they knew it was a simple tape intended to discourage the Viet Cong, they were so superstitious that they could not stop believing the words they heard. While the U.S. soldiers had their own ghosts, the South Vietnamese allies and civilians fell into the same psychological trap as the Viet Cong. It began to be noticed that in the area where the tape was broadcast, local farmers were reluctant to work the fields in the area. Fighters fighting alongside American troops also did not want to face the enemy for fear of dying there. Everyone believed that the spirits were suffering great anguish and pain from being lost. This was not the desired effect, but they could not stop. They needed to continue attacking a powerful rival. That is why they also included new variants to the effective operation. The most striking one did not have to do with the incorporation of new talking spirits, but rather they opted for the fear of something living. The transmission added the growl of a tiger. The sound engineers traveled to a zoo in Bangkok, Thailand, to obtain the recording and be able to incorporate it. This feline was a problem in the area, since its presence was a constant threat to the troops who sought to be hunters of their enemies, going into the jungle, but could end up being prey to a ferocious animal. The new tape was used on a hill controlled by the communists in South Vietnam. According to the American forces, by emitting the noises it caused 150 Viet Cong soldiers to abandon their positions. However, this success was diluted over time. Reports about Operation Wandering Soul became public, and people learned that it was all a farce. In several cases, enemy guerrillas, realizing that it was just a joke, concentrated fire on the helicopters that joined in with the tape transmissions. This caused the rivals' morale to drop and the strategy to lose strength.
But the true story of these voices was a closely guarded secret for years. It wasn't until 1969, when the first reports revealed to the public that the voices were actually part of a manipulative mixtape that was blasted across the countryside by American GIs.
The missions began to fail. By repeating the transmissions from nearby locations, the North Vietnamese were already ready to respond. As soon as the voices of the supposed spirits began to be heard, a wave of sniper fire and even rocket-propelled grenades fell on the U.S. troops. Perhaps they were no longer afraid of the ghost tape, or perhaps they fought that fear with bullets. The truth is that little by little the strategy was diluted, even though the people of Vietnam never gave up their beliefs. And to this day they hold them very firmly.
Currently, Wandering Souls Day, known in Vietnam as Vu Lan Day, is one of the most important celebrations in the country. Locals present offerings to their beloved departed, whose spirits visit the homes on the 15th of every month. Those sinful souls trapped in hell can be saved by prayer. Decades after the Vietnam War, families of Viet Cong soldiers fallen in combat kept looking for their loved ones to get them a proper burial.
The psychological warfare proposed by American specialists ended up disappearing, and the North American country was unable to complete its mission. Its objective of preventing the country from falling into the hands of communism failed, and it ended up withdrawing its troops on March 29, 1973, after a decade of fighting alongside the forces of South Vietnam. However, Operation Wandering Soul was one of its great interventions in the conflict, using all its resources for war. Coming to the end, we can say that despite having been a tactic of the United States, that does not mean that what happened in Vietnam was a complete farce. Without a doubt, there are things that we cannot see or explain, but that does not mean that they exist, and only the soldiers who were in that jungle will know the true answer. Now, after having learned the story of the creepy sounds in the jungles of Vietnam, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We will wait for you in our next video.